obvious. It is getting everything completely the wrong way round. So, of course, we're going to see more crisis and we're going to see more protests in the United States. And that is, for me, the single biggest change. Because up to now, in every iteration of the Arab-Israeli conflict, Palestinian-Israeli conflict that I can remember, US opinion has been solid in support of US policy with respect to Israel, supporting Israel. Today, it seems that is no longer the case. And I'm going to suggest that is the single greatest change, the most important change that we have seen, and the one that gives hope that in the future, we will start to see a change in US policy and a change towards actual peace in resolving this conflict. So I consider these protests in Colombia to be enormous, and not just Colombia, obviously, across the universities, an enormous and important sign and a crystallizing moment.
I think you've hit it exactly right on every point. And it's worth pointing out, if people are not aware, why is it so important to have this UN membership of Palestine, a state of Palestine, sovereign state recognized by the world community? The reason is that already going back to 2002, to the Arab Peace Initiative, and repeated since then, though not reported in our newspapers, par for the course, but repeated by the Arab League, repeated by the Arab and Islamic nations, again last November in Riyadh after this latest spasm of murder and massacre broke out in Gaza. The Arab and Islamic countries, and by the way, this includes clearly Iran, which has said so repeatedly, are ready for peace based on two states, with Palestine being a sovereign state, borders 1967 according to international law, capital in East Jerusalem, and control over the Islamic holy sites. That's the bottom line. And peace can be made on this absolutely sound, fair, practical, achievable, within reach grounds. And so the whole claim, the meme, the mantra, endlessly falsely repeated, there's no way to make peace, there's no one to talk to, they're out to kill us, all the rest, is plainly, blatantly falsified by the Arab and Islamic world. And they are the ones that can make the peace happen and will make the peace happen as part of a peace settlement. And the United States knows this. And Israel knows this. And the Israeli government knows this. They don't want peace. They want greater Israel. That's the problem. They're not looking for a practical solution. They're not looking for a fair solution. They're not looking for a just settlement. We are in the hands of extremists. We are in the hands of extremists that demand everything and have a lobby behind that. And those demands are what blocks the peace and threatens the world. Everybody gets it. Our students get it. The other 190 UN member states get it. But the Israeli government doesn't want it. That's the problem. That's why this vote is so essential. That's why the U.S. actions are so completely destructive, self-destructive of the politics, self-destructive of American interests, destructive of peace, all of it. But it's all predicated at the core on a fundamental irrationality of a radical extremist government in Israel, which has thought all along, we can get what we want. The U.S. stands irrevocably with us. We have all the power. Who's going to stop us? And so it's this mix of arrogance and extremism that brings us to this point. But the world is getting it. The question is, does Biden get anything anymore? Does he care? Jake Sullivan, not exactly the most sensitive barometer of global truth. He's the one, of course, who said last fall the Middle East is more quiet than it's been in 20 years. The week before the explosion occurred, showing how completely out of touch with reality they are. This is the question for me. Will they finally wake up at this penultimate moment? The answer probably is no, I have to say, unfortunately, because we could have the same discussion about Ukraine, and what we see is more and more irrationality in the West, less and less ability to have any kind of reasoned discussion, factual discussion. It's just spinning fantasies right now. And when people don't like the fantasies, when you have leaders that have 20% approval ratings, 25% approval ratings, just close meetings, crack down, stop protests. This is the direction we're heading right now. Absolutely amazing.
I completely agree. Can I just very quickly add a few things, and then just last words to Professor Sachs. The first is the point about negotiations, peace being unattainable. I'm sure, like Professor Sachs, I have been involved in many negotiations. I've mediated some. I've seen how even when the parties are enormously far apart or seem to be so, provided negotiations are conducted in good faith, solutions to even the most intractable problems eventually appear. The key problem is good faith. We have never had good faith negotiations at any point in the Middle East crisis, going all the way back to the 1940s. And by the way, we've also never had good faith negotiations over Ukraine, which is why we're in the crisis there that we are as well. But absolutely, if there are good faith negotiations, then all of these problems that people talk about, it's surprising. I've been surprised myself time and again how people who genuinely want to come to an agreement find solutions with each other. And I think that's a point that people never make. The second is about the administration. I don't believe there can be any possible chance of this administration doing anything that will create peace. I have followed them very closely. They say one thing, they do another. I think that this is an administration that always takes the maximalist position on anything. Whenever it talks about wanting compromise, be it over Ukraine, Taiwan, the Middle East, Gaza, whatever, what they're basically doing is stringing us along. I've come to that conclusion. Many governments around the world have done. The Chinese complain about it. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And the third is I think eventually there will be peace in the Middle East. I think there has to be, because there is no other ultimate way forward. And the sooner we start moving towards good faith negotiations, the better, and stop empowering these extreme elements, these maximalist elements, who, of course, because they're being empowered, they can always come back and say to other people in Israel, we don't need to negotiate. We can have it all because the Americans are behind us. The moment that ends, those people will diminish. That, again, is absolutely clear to me. So over you to Professor Sachs.
Yeah, just a word about good faith. You know, we are roughly 1 century into this conflict. It started in World War I, so it's a little more than 1 century with the Balfour Declaration, Versailles, the British Mandate, and so forth. So we go back a century. There has never been good faith by Britain or the United States for one moment in this region. And the modus operandi has always been manipulate, divide and conquer, the most basic maxim of empire. And what the US and Britain have never done is dealt honestly with the Arab world. There is an Arab League. There is diplomacy. There is Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Saudis, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and so forth. They get together. If we had true good faith negotiations between the United States, EU, by the way, the P5, because China and Russia can be absolutely helpful in making peace in this region, because there's no divide among the great powers, so-called, in actually desiring peace and in a sensible way. But what the U.S. continues to do is think it can game it, manipulate it, fake it, delay it. And of course, the Israel lobby is relentless in its pressure, and I think its destructiveness of Israel's, even its survival, the way that things are going, if it continues this extremist course. So I just want to underscore good faith. Good faith means that the countries of the region are actually treated with respect, honesty, transparency, because everybody in the region has the same incentive for peace and the same view, which is two states living side by side in security, and leave us alone. We have other things we want to do rather than engulf ourselves in endless war. So good faith would be the way to make it happen. I think you said it absolutely perfectly. It's so profoundly weird, I would say, especially for those of us my age who experienced the Cuban Missile Crisis and the first Cold War, not the one that we're in right now, which we now see is really a continuation. It never ended in 1992, contrary to legend. I make the mistake every once in a while of actually reading the comment lines under Financial Times articles. And the Financial Times is, Gideon Rockman, for example, writes something where he maybe has a sentence or two about the nuclear threat. And then all of the comments are, what threat? Don't let them blackmail us. Basically, what's a little nuclear war among friends? So you read this in the comment section and my God, you realize also how sad it must be to be a writer or reporter when that's your readership. Oh, come on, are you kidding? Because every comment is, don't worry about it. Don't be blackmailed about it. It's not real. I bet he won't do it. Let's find out. So what? And then if somebody writes, oh my God, we should take nuclear war seriously. Russian troll, Putin apologist. The moment you say something. So it is bizarre. And we had that experience, by the way, as a little controlled trial in the U.S. Biden says nothing about this, basically. But at I think it was 2022 in the fall, he said in a fundraiser to donors, which is really the only time he speaks to the, quote, American people, when he's speaking to some rich people in a private donor fundraiser. He said, we may be on the road to Armageddon. And he used the word Armageddon. What was the reaction in the press? It was literally the Wall Street Journal the next day or the day after in the editorial page chastising the president for scaring the American people. And how dare he use a word like that? And what's gotten into him? So the norm is don't discuss this. Don't consider this. And the idea is probably they won't do it. It's only 10% chance the world ends. It's the most insane feature of our time right now. And again, the pain of all of this is if one knows just a little bit of history, how false readings on radar of a bird flock that passed the radar looked like incoming ICBMs, and or a tape training tape that was left on that led a nighttime supervisor in an early warning system think that there was an incoming attack. Or the most famous, or should be famous, actually it's almost unknown, I should say, but the most remarkable incident in modern human history. It's a good quiz question to ask people. Which one individual above all most clearly saved the world? And the man's name is Arkhipov, and he's known by 1 in a million or maybe less in the world. And he was the Soviet political officer on a disabled Soviet submarine where the skipper of the submarine had ordered the firing of a nuclear-tipped torpedo after Kennedy and Khrushchev had arrived at their compromise agreement, but the word had not reached the disabled submarine. And under U.S. military doctrine, being fired upon by any nuclear weapon, a nuclear-tipped torpedo, a tactical battlefield nuclear weapon, or a strategic nuclear weapon, was to trigger the full nuclear arsenal of the United States against Russia, Soviet Union, China, and all of Central and Eastern Europe under the Soviet regime. And the estimates of those days was 700 million deaths out of 3 billion. Of course, not taking into account the global famine that would have followed and all the rest. And we came within a second of that. And it's not even known by most. And Daniel Ellsberg of the Pentagon Papers and Martin Sherwin, the great historian who died a couple of years ago and is the author of co-author of Oppenheimer, which became the movie, wrote about this in a book that everybody should read called Gambling with Armageddon. And the point of the book, which focuses on the Cuban Missile Crisis, but more generally discusses the fact that we're in the gamble with survival of the human species to an incredible extent. And he talks about this Arkhipov episode. People don't know these things. They're not thinking. They're not discussing them. They're not learning about them. And so somehow the fact that the U.S. might be embarrassed in Ukraine by not having its absolutely stupid idea of expanding NATO to Ukraine succeed is worth gambling with Armageddon. That's the situation we're in. And yes, every European leader stands up and salutes the United States in this, lies about everything, and says, sure, why risk it? And again, these leaders of the Baltic states, what the hell are they doing? They have countries of 1 or 2 or 3 million people on the border of Russia. They are not nuclear powers, but they're saying Russia must be destroyed. Are they out of their minds? Do they think the U.S. is really going to keep them safe? Do they think a nuclear war is going to just be dandy for Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania? What is on their minds? But your point is right. It's completely not understandable to me, but it is the reality that we do not have any self-control right now. And we have no capacity to understand our own behavior, maybe because it is this agenda of secretive intelligence armies for the last not even 30 years, but for the last 60 years. And it's on a kind of fixed rudder, and our politicians are useless in this. This is really where we stand. By the way, it's fascinating, and it's so hard to uncover all of this, but there's a lot of known history and some not so known history about how the CIA immediately starting in 1945, following OSS work started running the neo-Nazi units of Western Ukraine. The same groups, the Banderistas and others that are real. This isn't just a Russian figment of the imagination. These are literal groups with literal people who were literally on the CIA and MI6 account and were run for decades because they would help to undermine Russia or undermine the Soviet Union. So these games, which, you know, are the fun games of the James Bond movies and were mocked in Mad Magazine as the white spy and the black spy, you know, playing games with this is what's bringing us to 90 seconds to midnight right now.
I completely agree. Just again, a few points here. I mean, about the fact that there's been this disappearance of fear of nuclear war and this constant talking about the Russians bluffing. Bluffing is a word that comes from gambling. It just confirms that we are gambling on what the other side is doing, that we assume that they're bluffing, even whilst we insist that then we are not. It's an astonishing thing. And if it's the risk that they're not bluffing and that we could find ourselves in a nuclear war is 0.1%. That is too big a risk, far too big a risk. Any risk at all in this kind of situation is far too great, especially given that all of these problems which have existed and which have accumulated and which are getting worse are still problems that can be resolved properly through negotiations in a way that is not going to compromise or endanger anyone. And if we're talking about specifically the Baltic states, which are small countries next to this giant colossus, which is Russia, the best guarantor of their independence and security is Russia itself, not the superpower far away, a continent and an ocean away, which can only ultimately protect them by risking its own existence. Again, I would have thought that was obvious, and I would have thought, again, that a US president or a US administration ought to be pointing that fact out to them. And so should the other European countries, which are being led by the Baltic states into policies which I find astonishing. The influence, the sway that these Baltic states have achieved over European policy absolutely astonishes me. Now, these are not.
I can tell you, just to tell you a story about that. This Kaja Kallas, the leader of Estonia, I knew her dad actually rather well, Sim Kallas, who was in 1991 president of the Central Bank of Estonia. Estonia gained its independence in 1991. I had a very wonderful Estonian Canadian student who said, "Jeff, come to Tallinn. They need help." So I came to Tallinn back in 1991, in March 1991. Interestingly, the hotel was freezing. We had to wear a winter coat because there was no heat. There was no fuel. And I had a meeting with Sim Kallas one evening in a bar, and he described to me, "What do we do? We're in the ruble zone. We need to have we're a new nation. We need to have an independent currency." So I knew something about that. That was my my profession. So I designed basically on a napkin that evening how Estonia could make a national currency. They adopted it literally the next day, that idea, and a month later, the Estonian kroon appeared. Now, what's interesting for me is I was there. The Russians didn't try to stop it. The Soviet Union wasn't even over yet at that time. And there was no attempt by Russia to invade Estonia. There was no desire to, quite the contrary. I was working with Gorbachev's team. I was working with Yeltsin after September 1991. I was working with the Estonians on helping them to design a post-ruble currency, which went into effect. The Russians wanted peace. They wanted quiet. They wanted rebuilding. They wanted integration with Europe. It was so normal. This is exactly the moment that Cheney is saying, okay, now we dismember Russia. This is the crazed mindset of this hubristic, indispensable nation, the United States. It just could not say yes. And now I see the daughter. Yeah, I got one of the highest awards of the Estonian state for my work in helping them set up the currency, because it remained stable for the next 20 years, and then they adopted the euro. It was a good success, good economic success, especially for an evening discussion about how to set up a currency. And now I see this hatred from the Estonians, hatred, but provocation and warmongering, as if this is going to keep them safe. Are you kidding? It's completely the opposite. By the way, I was advisor to Poland in those years. I was their main outside advisor. And now I see Poland talking the same way. Radek Sikorski, the most aggressive foreign minister in Central and Eastern Europe, not to be compared with Baerbock, who is, Minister of War of Germany, in effect. But basically, where does the hate talk come from when it is not Russia that made these aggressions over the last 30 years? Just the opposite, when the United States could not say yes. But this is where the propaganda or the mental image or just the being suborned by U.S. Money and power in the military-industrial complex has come in. Almost nobody tells the truth. Well, Judge, good to be with you. The whole world, except for the United States and Israel, believes that we need to move now to two states living side by side, Israel and Palestine, with no doubt a wall between them at the start. This is not a happy relationship, but it doesn't have to be a site of bloodshed either. So in 2011, Palestine, which is already recognized as a state by 140 UN member states, though not by the United States, applied for full UN membership as what would be now the 194th UN member state. And when you make that application, it goes to the Security Council after clearing one step with the Secretary General of the UN. Then the Security Council, meeting as an admissions committee, not formally as the Security Council, but it's the same members, decide whether the criteria are met for UN membership. After that, if the answer is decided to be yes, as a yes, then it is forwarded to the UN Security Council for a vote. And if the Security Council approves, then it goes to the UN General Assembly. In 2011, at the technical level, the decision was that Palestine qualifies as a member state. And it would have gone forward, but for the United States, which at that point leaned on the Palestinian Authority and said, don't do it right now. It's not convenient, but it'll come very soon. Just accept observer status for the moment. That'll let you in the building, but don't press for full membership. You'll get there very soon. The United States gave assurances that this was just a short adjustment period. That, of course, was 13 years ago. The U.S. And Israel blocked it all that time. When the violence broke out on October 7th with the Hamas attack, and then after that, the Israeli invasion of Gaza, the Palestinian Authority said we cannot have peace unless we can have our state and our sovereignty for our people. And so they reactivated the application. It wasn't a new application. It was the application that was in suspension because of the United States. When they reactivated, all over the world, government said, of course, this is what is needed. And I had discussions with many senior diplomats, with foreign ministers, with heads of state about this, who believe that, of course, this is the way to end this conflict, that there should be two states, they should live in mutual security, that the United Nations should ensure that they're not at each other's throats when they are both side by side. Incidentally, Palestine would join under the UN Charter as a, quote, peace-loving state. It could not join as a state determined to bring an end to Israel. And the Arab and Islamic countries have made clear now, since the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, so for more than 20 years, that in the event of a two-state settlement, there would be normalization of diplomatic relations across the region with Israel. This would be the core of Israel's security, an end of state of war, an end of funding of military or militia that are in opposition to Israel and so forth. In other words, diplomacy, because a solution would have been reached. So the vote came to the Security Council last week with an overwhelming support, except, as usual, one country stood in the way of the global will. Technically, two. Israel, of course, this government opposes it. It wants ownership over all of the territory, both of Israel and of Palestine. That is the core reason for this conflict. Israel's demands that are, in my view, absolutely incompatible with peace and with justice. But the second obstacle is the United States, which has given essentially a blank check to Israel. And so when the vote came, it was absolutely remarkable. 12 countries out of the 15 voted for. 2 abstained because the UK will never vote against the United States. And Switzerland was the second one, leaned on by the US. And then the US vetoed this measure. Now, this proposition will go to the UN General Assembly, which has the jurisdiction to take up an issue when there is a deadlock in the Security Council. There will be a vote in the UN General Assembly sometime in the coming weeks on Palestine's membership. It will be overwhelming, but it will be advisory. It will show that the will of the world overwhelmingly is for two states living side by side. When the General Assembly takes that action, it will go back to the UN Security Council. Of course, the United States is absolutely preventing a solution right now. That has essentially been true for years and decades, I would say. The U.S. Is not an honest broker. It is a completely dishonest broker in this affair. Israel controls U.S. policy in this regard. The U.S. is completely subservient, despite this not being in America's interest at all. America is diplomatically isolated. It is on the wrong side of history, as we say. It is on the wrong side of justice. It is playing with fire, because we are every day in that tinderbox away from a general war in the Middle East. The U.S. is pumping in billions, tens of billions of dollars that we can ill afford, and that is no substitute for peace. And that vote of another 26 billion, depending on which parts you put in for Israel, was just made last Saturday with no strings attached by the U.S. Congress, because basically U.S. policy is run by the Israel lobby in this regard.
Before we get to the Congress, here's Secretary. This will aggravate you, Professor Sachs. Here's Secretary Blinken attempting to answer a very astute question: was the United States isolated at the UN?
On the UN Security Council, the United States was isolated yesterday. Your allies, close allies, France, Japan, and South Korea, both voted for admitting Palestine as a member. The Israelis, including Netanyahu, on the record saying they oppose two-state solution. So what is the path forward, and what message do you give to Palestinians and to moderates in the region if you truly want to isolate extremes?
First, we are committed, the United States is committed to achieving a Palestinian state. We believe that that is vital to having long-term, sustainable, durable peace and security. And of course, it's the only way to fulfill the aspirations, the rightful aspirations of the Palestinian people. But getting to that, achieving that state, has to be done through diplomacy, not through imposition. And the resolution that was voted at the Security Council will have no effect on actually moving things forward.
What is he talking about? The United States is committed to achieving a Palestinian state. This was not done through diplomacy. Does the man know what he's talking about?
Well, to be charitable to him, it's an idiotic statement. To be uncharitable, it is an utterly deceitful statement. I don't know with Blinken which it is. It's sheer, complete foolishness. And it's deadly. It's literally deadly to the Palestinian people. It is extremely dangerous. If he wants to have diplomacy, I can give him some good advice, even friendly advice. I talk to diplomats every day. Apparently, he does not in the same way. I speak to diplomats throughout the Middle East. They are ready for peace. They are ready for Israel's security. What he means is something else, which is that Israel gets a veto on Palestine's right to political self-determination. That there's no principle for that. Right. But that's what he's saying. He's saying that Israel gets to veto Palestine's right to self-determination. When that issue came up in the General Assembly several weeks ago in a resolution on Palestine's right to self-determination, the United States was one of 4 countries in the entire world, that's out of 193, to vote against Palestine's right to self-determination. Which were the 4? The 4 were Israel, the United States, Micronesia, which is an island.
Don't we own Micronesia?
Well, Micronesia has a compact with the United States that it must vote alongside the U.S. So it's 110,000 people in the Pacific. And the 4th was a very nice little island named Nauru with 12,000 people. Honestly, the United States is completely isolated. The problem with what Blinken says is that it reflects the astounding arrogance of the United States not to hear anything of the rest of the world and to make these utterances, which are meaningless, self-contradictory, inimical to solutions, and to believe that this is a way that grown-ups would talk. He is our chief diplomat, but he clearly does not understand the first thing about diplomacy in this response. There's every capacity to have a diplomatic solution to this crisis, except if the United States says we take no judgment other than what Israel wants, because what this government of Israel wants is to deny Palestine anything. And if all we say is diplomacy comes down not to the 8 billion people around the world and the 192 other governments, but only to what one government, Israel, says, that's not diplomacy. That's recklessness.
How dangerous, how reckless, to pick up on your word, was the vote in the House of Representatives to send, again, depending upon the number, 13, 20, or 26 billion dollars to Israel and $61 billion to Ukraine, knowing that the latter doesn't go to Ukraine, the lion's share of it stays here, but it's sort of unleashed a false sense of euphoria amongst President Zelensky and his people. But I'll let you address it. How dangerous was that vote?
Well, what it means is more deaths and more killing and no solutions. For Ukraine, it's a profoundly cynical action to extend Ukraine on the battlefield with thousands and thousands of deaths every month, to extend this past the November election. It's nothing more than that. But it is how our military-industrial state operates. The CIA gave the briefing, and the Congress fell into line, because the CIA, believe me, is more powerful than the White House in this. This is the security state, and it dictates, and we're going to get past November one way or another. So this was a completely cynical and destructive action, because it was irrational in that there was no coherent discussion of alternatives. Everything that Speaker Johnson had said for months about the need for a plan, the need for a strategy, the need for clear goals, everything was just put aside after he got his CIA briefing, and that was it. So totally irrational, and not even an attempt at how he could switch completely from one day to the next, which is what he did, except that both parties are subservient to the military-industrial complex in this country, not to the American people who are opposed to this, not to the Republican Party, which is overwhelmingly in opposition to this legislation that just passed with substantial Republican support, including support of the Republican Speaker of the House. When it comes to Israel, it is feeding a genocide. The International Court of Justice is likely to rule that Israel is committing genocide in the legal sense of violating the 1948 Genocide Convention. And we are complicit in that, absolutely explicitly. Incidentally, we had Senator Schumer talk about how miserable the Israeli government is. We had several members of Congress say we need to put restrictions on this. There's horrible crimes, war crimes by Israel going on. None of that applied in the end. It's just giving munitions for more slaughter.
Here's the, this will upset you. Here's the scene on the floor of the House of Representatives at the time that the vote was tallied. Take a look at what appears to be in the hands of most of the Republican members of the House as they cheered the announcement of the outcome of the vote.
I missed it, but thank you. Okay. The House will be in order. The House will be in order. The chair would remind my colleagues to observe proper decorum. Flag waving on the floor is not appropriate. The House will be in order. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise? I said, no. The gentlewoman from Florida.
Stand up. Stand up.
Okay. The gentlewoman is not recognized. Colleagues, no, I'm going to. The House will be in order.
Like children waving Ukrainian flags on the floor of the House. That was one of the Republicans that voted against it, who admonished everybody else to, quote, put the damn flags away. And then he took the microphone away from her.
Your one's reminded, forgive them, they know not what they do.
Yeah,
what they're doing is sending tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands more young Ukrainians to their death. That's what they're doing, because they are absolutely unaware of any of the real issues in this conflict, unaware of its genesis, unaware of its possible resolution. All they seem to know is war, and they're ignorant. They don't study this. They don't look at alternatives. They don't say one word about diplomacy. They know nothing. They don't understand the consequences. It's regrettable how really sad our government has devolved into almost this ludicrous display of irrationality and immaturity, because that's what this is. This wasn't a considered discussion, a considered deliberation taken after careful reflection of the myriad possibilities, alternative approaches, and likely consequences. This is kind of an ignorant mob waving their flags that has already condemned around 500,000 Ukrainians to their deaths or grave wounds, that has lost a great deal of territory, not because Putin was out to take the territory, but because the United States at every stage refused basic diplomacy over the issue of the U.S. placing its military along the Russian border. That's the issue we've never discussed. That's the issue that the New York Times will not tell its some thumb-sucking readers, excuse me, because they can't read that thing as adults, that New York Times. It has no facts. And that's what leads us to this kind of display in Congress. We are in the grips of phoniness and irrationality. We're not considering alternatives. We're not discussing honestly any of the dynamics of these conflicts. We're not discussing where they came from and how they can be ended. It's a game. It's a small insider game. In the end, the Congress buckles in to the campaign contributions of Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics and Boeing and the Israel lobby and all the rest. All these people know is that they got to get out back to their home districts and with the funding for their advertisements so that they can do more damage as reelected representatives after November. We're in a trap. We're in a trap of utter irrationality. Nothing's explained to the American people. No truth underpins any of these decisions. Nobody wants to debate it. The President of the United States, I'm sure, could not debate this.
No. And there was no serious debate on the floor of the House.
Yes, excuse me, just to say that the fact that the Speaker of the House could be against it, and then one day flip the position entirely and push it through, just should tell everybody that this is a world of make-believe that happens to leave hundreds of thousands dead as if they don't count, and as if it's not, just as if it's not serious at all.
The same Speaker of the House was against warrantless spying. When the CIA visited him, he changed his mind. The vote in the House of Representatives was 212 in favor, 212 against the simple amendment to require the intelligence community and the FBI to get a warrant when they want to spy on Americans. He left the speaker chair to come down to the well of the House and break the tie and vote against that amendment. So whatever the CIA tells the Speaker of the House in secret, boy, I'd like to know what it is, because they get this guy to flip on the most significant issues of our day: the Constitution and human life, war and peace,
without need for any coherent explanation after the fact at all.
Right.
That's the game.
Was a professor, I think you may know her, but was an academic arrested in Israel for something said in a classroom, and then the courts released her the following day. Do I have this correct?
Yes.
Professor Sachs?
I don't know all the details, but there was a professor of Hebrew University arrested for not towing the line on Israel's unacceptable, in my view, positions vis-a-vis Palestine. But what's happening now is we're seeing a general crackdown across universities.
What is happening at Columbia, where you are a tenured member of the faculty?
100 students were arrested for basically quietly protesting on the lawn at the university. And the president of the university called in the police, and 100 students were taken away in zip cuffs. And it's completely broken the community apart. Yale students, several dozen, were arrested in the last 24 hours, from what I understand. The idea that universities should be places of crackdown, and that speech, if you don't like it, that's a kind of harassment that should be shut down. This is what we have come to, because these positions that the US government is taking, or that Israel is taking, are not defensible, by the way, in normal debate and discourse. So opposition to them is met increasingly violently by the arrest of our own students. It's shocking to see, except that this is what has become the American political scene.
This happened the day after the president of Columbia University appeared before a House committee known for berating university presidents and threatening that the millions of dollars that the federal government gives for legitimate academic research would be restricted if the federal government's view, if the Biden administration's view, although in this case the interrogators were Republicans, they're hardly in the Biden administration.
Let's just say in Washington's view, because it's the Congress and the White House.
Correct. If in Washington's view, the speech was contrary to what Washington wanted to hear, haven't they remembered that they took an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, which includes the First Amendment? And the last time you and I read it, it said Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech.
No, they don't recall that. They don't believe it. They are utterly irresponsible and opportunistic. The decision to arrest the students was taken not the day after, it was taken the same day as the president's testimony that evening. It was taken without consultation with the students, without an attempt at a face-to-face discussion. It was not taken in response to violence. It was the New York Police Department coming onto the campus and arresting students that were sitting on the lawn or in tents. Whatever the law, and I think it violated the law, I can tell you it broke the community in two, because universities have an ethos. The ethos is that they are a community. They're a place where you study, where you debate, you can argue, but it's a place of thinking. And thinking can be tough. It can be very hard debate.
But
you
these
can
people
you can
wanna
hear
take
things
these
you can
people-
hear things you don't want to hear.
Right.
That's part of life.
These
The
people want
students
to
need to
take a
face that too.
category of speech and say it is unprotected. The government can go after you for that category of speech. They can call it hate speech, dangerous speech, whatever they want to call it. That's why all speech is protected, particularly in an environment dedicated to the dissemination of unpopular ideas.
But the kind of speech that the most famous attack was on the chant or the saying or the slogan from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Now, the river is the Jordan River, the sea is the Mediterranean, and it is a chant for Palestinian rights. It could be a claim for one state. It could be many things, but what it surely is political speech.
Absolutely.
And that's extremely important. In fact, the irony of this is, of course, the extremist Israeli leaders use exactly the same phrase. They also talk about from the river to the sea, there will be greater Israel. So there's a symmetry. On one side, it should be all Palestinian. On the other side, it should be all Israel. I happen to disagree with both sides, but I don't think that it's right to arrest people for saying this from either side. That's the idea of political debate. It's also not right to be bombing people because you're trying to create a greater Israel. So there are limits. The limits are the bombs, the mass killings, the 35,000 people dead at Israel's hand by the current count, but it's expected that the actual count is multiples of that because there are people under the rubble. There are people who are starving to death. There are people who are dying of disease. There are people who are dying of lack of medical care because the hospitals have been bombed out. That's what should be prohibited. This war, not speech, not even heated speech. Heated speech is not calling to attack a student or not. That kind of assault is not permitted. But the charge that the congressional members made was directly, explicitly about political speech in a context where we need political debate. We need more political debate, not less of it.
Here's a congressman from New York. I couldn't believe I was seeing this. The last clip we'll play for you because I know this will get under your skin also. Offering a resolution condemning the phrase. I never heard of this fellow, Congressman Anthony Desposito, but watch this.
My resolution condemns the slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, because it is blatantly anti-Semitic. Madam Speaker, I remind my colleagues that this slogan was used by Iranian leaders responsible for the recent attacks on Israel. This slogan communicates one thing and one thing only. It is not human rights. It is certainly not peace. It is the violent destruction of the state of Israel and the Jewish people that live within it. To employ this slogan is to perpetuate the cause of hate and regional instability. Between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea sits Israel, a free, diverse nation, a safe haven for Jewish people, formed in the wake of the mass murder of European Jews. When the world witnessed the tragedies of the Holocaust, we said never again. Now is our chance to mean it and to reject anti-Semitic hate in all of its forms, whenever and wherever it rears its ugly head.
I don't know if they actually voted on this resolution. It's reprehensible that Congress should think it even can be in the business of condemning speech, no matter what the speech says. Hate
But,
speech.
but by the way, it's so interesting, so sad, so primitive. Here's a representative. He says, in between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean lies Israel. If he had said, in between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean lies Israel and Palestine, well, then we would have the start of the discussion that the whole rest of the world is having.
Right.
Between the river and the sea, there are two peoples and two nations. And the Palestinian nation, Palestinian state, already recognized by 140 UN member states. But he doesn't say that. And it's meaningful that he doesn't say that. He's ignorant, I'm sure, but completely insensitive to the realities. Now, while one side is chanting about from the river to the sea, maybe wanting one state, which many people, by the way, Jews and Palestinians believe, although most do not, most want two. But just as people are chanting that, on the other side are Israeli leaders who use the same expression, from the river to the sea, for greater Israel. And they're not just chanting it, they are killing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Palestinians right now before our eyes to achieve their aim. That's a difference. And this congressman just voted more money for that, for the killing. So he doesn't see the irony that a slogan used by both sides can mean the opposite in each direction. He's condemning one side, not the other, while the other side is slaughtering the counterpart, slaughtering, and not just slaughtering the counterpart, killing one child every 10 minutes in Gaza at the latest count, every 10 minutes, but with this congressman's vote, his approval, his vote for the munitions to do that slaughter. So he's complaining about speech, but he's complicit in mass murder. Good for him. How intelligent. This is our Congress.
Right.
It's astounding. In fact, it's explicitly the same idea. If you read the things that the U.S. government actually writes about security, defense, so-called, and foreign policy strategy, the key idea is what they call primacy. That the U.S. should be the most powerful country in every region of the world. Not only the most powerful of a world power, but the most powerful in every region. It needs to dominate. So in Europe, it needs to dominate Russia. That's what we've been talking about. In Asia, it needs to dominate China. Well, good luck on that. China's 1.4 billion people, a very sophisticated society. And strangely enough, China does not want to be dominated by the United States. China has enough memory of what foreign domination has meant. The British behaved abysmally in China, and the Chinese see the Americans, rightly so, as part of that Anglo-Saxon mentality. Remember, the British invaded China in 1839 to force China to accept opium. It's amazing. It's like as if the Colombian cocaine cartel invaded the United States to say you have to open your markets to Colombian cocaine.
That was a brilliant comparison. Brilliant comparison.
Oh, but this is exactly what Britain did, and China. They don't forget that. And now, what this has practically meant is that starting around 20 years ago, but really 10 years ago intensively, the United States strategists, if you could call them that, said China's rise is a threat to the United States because China's a big country. And so we have to take measures to stop China's rise. This is a kind of insanity, actually, because it's exactly what leads to wars. It's not the business of the United States to try to stop China's rise, but that's precisely what they are doing through unilateral tariff measures, blocking China's exports to the U.S., blocking American investments in China, taking measures like this stupid one last month where the U.S. Congress voted that TikTok has to either close or sell its operations to an American company. The U.S. went after Huawei, which is an excellent company, very innovative, very dynamic, and that's precisely why the U.S. attacked it, because it was too successful. The U.S. has stopped the sale of advanced semiconductors to China. The U.S. thinks this is normal, but the most dangerous point is the U.S. is doing in Taiwan what it did in Ukraine. You know, for Ukraine, this is core Russian security. For the United States to say we're going to move our military into Ukraine is a direct and immediate threat to Russian security, a point that Putin has made for basically 20 years. In the case of China, Taiwan is the same security threat for China, especially after the period from 1839 to 1949, where imperial powers continued to invade China, threaten Chinese unity, carve off pieces of China as part of Japan's empire, and so on. China says, don't meddle in our unity. And that's why when countries establish diplomatic relations with China, they must adopt the one China policy, which says you are not going to try to separate pieces of China and divide our country again, as you did for a century, from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. Taiwan looms very large in that story because Taiwan, actually both Taiwan and mainland China, the People's Republic of China, both have in their founding documents, the Republic of China in Taipei says there's one China. They disagree who should run it, but it's one China. But when the United States established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, it adopted the one China policy, that Taiwan is part of China. And yet it plays games, worse than games, extremely dangerous measures, saying, well, we're going to have a trade agreement with Taiwan. We're going to have arms agreements with Taiwan. We're going to support Taiwan's security, all while Taiwan is supposed to be part of China. And the United States ignores mainland China on this, ignores the People's Republic of China. Well, this is absolutely heading towards a war if the U.S. continues this. And I can't emphasize enough how stupid our Congress members are. They're people that are completely irresponsible. They don't know any history. They come from someplace in America, thousands of miles away from China. They've never been to China, but boy, they know everything about China. And they know that they're going to send weapons to Taiwan and they're going to protect Taiwan. And what they are doing is leading us closer and closer to war. And in the United States, in our press, this idea of a war with China is being normalized. It's mentioned almost every day in some news story. Oh, maybe there'll be a war with China, as if this isn't one of the greatest insanities one could imagine. because this would be potentially the end of the world. Yet the American mainstream media normalizes a war with Russia or normalizes a war with China as if this is absolutely normal and necessary, because after all, the United States needs to be number one in the world, and it's going to do what it needs to do to be number one. And in the meantime, this is what's leading to chaos in so many places.
Exactly. It's horrible. I would say that there was nothing similar so far in the, let's say, in the history. You remember the Caribbean crisis. The leaders of both Washington and Moscow, at a certain moment, they understood that this is the red line. They should not cross at any, let's say, situation or circumstances. They were clever enough to stop from both sides, and this lecture, this lesson, was taken as something of a key importance for next many decades. Now, as if this is a taboo. It's unbelievable. I mean,
yeah, although I would say the following. You know, I've studied the Cuban Missile Crisis for a long time, tried to understand it. The truth is, we were extraordinarily lucky to get out of that alive. And it is, in the U.S. case, most of Kennedy's, John F. Kennedy's top advisors wanted to go to war. They wanted to have a military approach. Mm-hmm. It was almost only Kennedy and a couple of others, Adlai Stevenson and a couple of others, said, no, we need a diplomatic way out. Mm-hmm. On the Soviet side, there was actually more prudence. I don't think Gromyko wanted a war, and Nikita Khrushchev certainly didn't want a war. And in fact, when he put the missiles into Cuba in 1962, Gromyko said, what is this? Are we going to war? And Khrushchev said, no, we're not going to war, but we're just going to we're going to teach the Americans a little bit of their own medicine because they have missiles in Turkey. We're going to show them what it's like. But it was a big miscalculation because it almost led to the end of the world. But Khrushchev and Kennedy had the sense to pull back. But I'm not sure that our politicians today have that sense. Honest to God, I have to tell you, there are so many stupid and irresponsible American politicians. You can't even believe it. They don't care about war. They talk about war as normal. They want to send so many Ukrainians to their deaths because they even say the Ukraine war is wonderful. No Americans are dying, as if 500,000 Ukrainians aren't enough dead, and as if the risk of nuclear war isn't great enough. So I'm very worried. In the United States system, so much power resides in the president. We've had a string of very mediocre to poor to dangerous presidents over the last 20 years. None of them has risen to the occasion. None. This is really very worrisome because our political system is broken. It's corrupted. It's not bringing the best people to the forefront by any means. Our two lead candidates right now, I regard Biden's presidency as a failure because he doesn't understand diplomacy. He's also 81 and he's too old for this job. And Trump is a very unstable person. These are our two lead candidates. This is something terrible for the world. And in the meantime, so many European leaders, I think, including in the Czech Republic, say, oh, yes, we follow the United States. That's our greatest ally. We have to do whatever the United States does. And don't people realize, don't do that. Be careful. You know, Europe needs its own strategy, and it needs a strategy of peace, not a strategy of war.
Exactly. Tell me, as an American, after all these critical formulations, where is the break-even point, or how to call it, which would bring your political class, your political elite, to an understanding that the policies based on the obsessive primacies, let's say, targets and so on, are not realistic, and that a win-win strategy is the only, let's say, realistic option, which will be very good also for the United States. When and where this moment would come?
It's very important to know this and very hard to answer this. I can't imagine Biden or Trump leading that. And yet these are the two leading candidates right now. Neither of them has an understanding or realistic vision of the world. Neither of them has the idea that the world should be unified and in peace so that it can address problems together. None of them has the idea that the U.S. and China should cooperate with each other because it's the two most powerful countries, and the worst thing in the world would be a war, even a Cold War, but a hot war between them is unimaginable. And so how this is going to happen and when is really a major puzzle. And what I believe is the case is that only the U.S., to get out of this peacefully, has to listen to public opinion. I work at the UN every day. At the UN, it's clear that the vast majority of countries in the world want peace and cooperation, and they don't want to choose sides between the U.S. and China or between the U.S. and Russia. They don't want to choose sides. They don't want to impose sanctions on Russia. They don't want to go to war against Russia because the U.S. tells them to do so. So I'm trying to explain to American public opinion and to American politicians that they're running against the whole spirit of the whole world. The U.S. is becoming increasingly isolated. One of the problems is, though, so much of Europe follows the U.S. blindly right now. And this is a puzzle for me because Europe's smarter than the U.S. It has more bad experience also in war. It should understand that this is a dead end. And Europe should understand, of course, that American hegemony or American primacy is not Europe's advantage. Europe is going to benefit from a multipolar world in which Europe is one of the poles of power, creativity, insight, and diplomacy, not as a vassal state of NATO. And yet the European leaders are very bad at this right now. You look at van der Leyen, she's, in my view, nothing but a U.S. bureaucrat, basically. Yes, I find it very, very sad. And European foreign policy is basically do what the U.S. says. And if the U.S. blows up the Nord Stream pipeline, endangering the European economy, everybody pretends it didn't happen. Or pretends that it was Russia that blew up its own pipeline or some other crazy idea like that.
Yeah. One more specific question, if you allow me. You have in the States the act called FARA or FARA, Foreign Agents Regulation Act or something like this. There is a similar law in Russia, in Israel, and so on. And frankly speaking, in the countries like the Czech Republic, there's a growing interest in that maybe we should have something similar, because these as if NGOs, which are led by people from George Soros and so on, they are, let's say, playing their own games beyond any legal, let's say, democratic procedures and so on. And in other countries like, say, Georgia now, there's a big dispute whether the country can have a law which would, let's say, regulate somehow the activities of similar entities. What is your opinion upon this?
My opinion is very clear, which is the United States should stop meddling in the politics of other countries. Because what this is about is not simply NGOs. This is about politics. This is about U.S. money, official and quasi-private, because even these NGOs are aligned with the U.S. government. But this is about U.S. money turning the politics of other countries, even stoking unrest like the Maidan in Ukraine was a U.S.-funded operation. How do I know? Because they told me, because I saw it with my own eyes. U.S. Improper involvement in what was a coup. I saw it, and I hated it. And I have to say that this is what's happening in Georgia, too. The U.S. says, oh, this is an infringement of Georgian rights. The infringement of Georgian rights is that the U.S. is meddling in Georgian politics. The U.S. should keep out of Georgian politics, and with all respect, Georgians should keep out of American politics.
Exactly.
So this is the basic point. And these laws are put in place to try to stop the meddling. We had senators go to the Maidan and chant to the people there, "We're with you, we're on your side," and so forth. Imagine if Chinese politicians had come to Donald Trump's rally on January 6th, 2021. Do you think the American people would say, "Oh, that's fine. Isn't that nice? Other countries are getting involved in our riots or our demonstrations or our protests or whatever"? No, the United States would not like it at all. It would drive our politics crazy. And indeed, even the false charges of Russian involvement in U.S. politics drove American politics crazy. But it's very important to understand, when you are an empire like the United States, double standards is the basic principle. The basic principle. You don't have to be consistent. You do what you tell others not to do. And the U.S. meddles everywhere in the world through the National Endowment of Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, USAID, NGOs. I know it. I've seen it with my own eyes. It's not good. It's not healthy. This is what's going on right now.
Last question. I'm too much consuming of your time. There is a category of enemy images. We understand, most of us, what does it mean. And this is an even ever bigger instrument in the dirty games, which are pushing the world to very critical, if not dangerous, let's say, situations. What can we, Jeff, do, let's say, against these enemy images? And could we somehow cooperate across the Atlantic in these efforts?
We need to cooperate globally, because we need to bring in Chinese colleagues, Russian colleagues, African colleagues, Latin American colleagues. We hear so much falsity. I almost never hear the truth from the U.S. government anymore. I know the situation with my own eyes all over the world, because that's my work. My work is to be abroad. My work is to be engaged in discussions with governments all over the world. That's what it means to work with the United Nations and on international objectives. And so I hear directly many things, and I can see with my own eyes and hear with my own ears that the U.S. is lying so much of the time. Now, the mainstream media generally repeats these lies. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the main cable networks. This is a big problem, because the public hears a false view of things. And in Europe, it's been the same. Ever since the Ukraine war broke out, if you say anything that says, well, there's a background to it, there's a history to it, there should have been peace, this has to do with NATO, immediately you're branded, you're a Putin apologist, you're a fool, you get on Ukraine's hate list, many things, all to shut down debate. Same thing is happening with respect to Israel right now. Israel is committing terrible war crimes, I believe genocide. But if you say so, oh no, you're violating every standard, every norm. So truth is really at a premium right now, and that's why what you're doing and alternative outlets are so important, because and it's probably the big benefit of the digital age in this regard. There are many downsides, but at least we have the chance to hear a wider range. You have to search for it. It's not going to come in the mainstream media. And interestingly, we had Tucker Carlson in the United States interview President Putin, and he was attacked by all the mainstream. How dare you do that? And yet hundreds of millions of people watch that, apparently. And that is amazing, because people want to hear themselves. They don't want to hear it through these government propaganda outlets, basically. So this is what we really need to do. It's hard, and the dangers are very high right now, because we're really in the midst of a very, very serious crisis, which, as I've explained, I believe the United States has done the most to instigate, actually. And we need diplomacy just to stay alive. And if we can stay alive and stop the worst, then we can work on getting the truth out too. I've been visiting Israel now for 52 years on many occasions. Israel changed. It changed a lot. There was always, of course, demands that I didn't agree with and actions that I didn't agree with. There was a movement for peace in Israel called Shalom Achav in the 1970s and 80s that I agreed with. The words in Hebrew mean peace now, not peace later, but peace now. And there were always important elements in Israel that didn't want peace now. They wanted settlements now. They wanted to delay things. But things changed in Israel. There is a difference of Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin from Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and Netanyahu. The leaders in the past, they wanted favorable outcomes, but they actually wanted a solution. Yitzhak Rabin died for that. He was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli extremist, perhaps part of a broader network. We don't know all of the details of that. But there's definitely a difference, in my view, between the Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres's of Israel's past and the Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, Gallants of Israel's present. One thing that happened was the settler movement. Now, the settlement started in the occupied territories already by the late 60s and early 1970s. When I first got to Israel in 1972 as a kid, out of high school, it was explained to me that Israel was, quote, putting facts on the ground. It was going to make security arrangements by having settlements in key locations in the occupied West Bank. I thought, this doesn't sound so good. When you make facts on the ground, what you're doing is violating international law. You're creating a situation that's going to become conflictual in the years ahead. But Israel was pretty triumphant and pretty dominant in those days. But that settler movement became a religious extremist movement also. It changed culture. It brought some extremist rabbis to the forefront. It became a fervent messianic movement among hundreds of thousands of settlers and their families and friends. So suddenly the biblical references became not just once in a while mentioned, but dominant. God gave us the whole land. Today in the United States, the police and the Congress pound on students chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. But it is the Israeli extremists who are the ones literally saying, God promised us the land from the river, that is the Jordan River, to the Mediterranean Sea. The extremism in Israel came to view not occupation, but greater Israel as a redemptive, religious, nationalist, messianic cause. I think this is a lot to do with what has happened. That, of course, some Israelis said we have implacable foes, this is a matter of security. But a kind of messianism also became very important politically. And in Israel's fractured coalition governments, they play a disproportionate role. This is the Smotrich, who is the finance minister, Ben Gvir is the national security minister. They're absolutely extremists. And they represent a view that is extraordinarily dangerous, extraordinarily extreme, extraordinarily preventing any kind of peace. So in this sense, Israeli politics and Israeli culture and society changed enormously